Welcome to Storytime by Night Before Dawn. The Girl in the Yard. My mother loved fairy tales. She taught me to love them too. I never outgrew them. If anything, the older I got, the more I needed them. In fairy tales, you find happy endings, lessons, morals, comfort, triumph, and magic. But you will find no sadness. That's why I needed them, because I was sad and angry. I was sad and angry because my mother was dying, and there was nothing I could do but watch. I watched as every part of her withered, except her stomach. It grew hard and distended, almost engorged as if she were pregnant. I guess she was, except the thing she carried wasn't life, but her death. I watched as she mastered the wide, glimmering smile she wore whenever she went out, which was less and less as time wore on. I watched as she told a fairy tale of her own. I'll be better soon. I watched as she cried and held my brother Noah. He was only 3 years old, but already doomed, fragile, sick, and slow, with no hope of a normal life, or even a long one. So I watched him too. With Dad gone, and Mom rotting from the inside out, I was the only one who could. Over the years, I've heard wonderful, inspirational stories. Modern fairy tales, you could say, of siblings who came together in the face of tragedy, who forge unbreakable bonds and take care of each other, no matter what. I was not that brother. Noah was the bane of my existence, frail, stubborn, and impossible to care for, yet in need of more care than anyone. I hated every minute I spent with him. I hated that Mom loved him most. I hated doing everything, for him and for her, only to be shunted into the background at every turn. As days grew into weeks and months, that hatred sank deep. Every time I scrubbed my mother's vomit or threw her soiled sheets into the washer, every time Noah threw a tantrum, every time I watched my mom gaze at him like he was the second coming of Christ, every time I had to give everything I had, only to find out that it wasn't enough, the hatred grew. I buried it under fresh layers of poisoned stoicism and molten resentment that hardened over time, cooling into a core. I could practically see it, jagged, mineral, the color of storm clouds, slowly but surely replacing me. Hate wasn't the only thing I felt, but it was the easiest thing to feel. So I hated everything. I hated being with my mother. I hated the sight of my brother. I hated being the oldest. I hated school. I hated the doctors. I hated my father for leaving after Noah was born. I hated myself for wishing I could leave too. The only thing I didn't hate was my home. It had steep, sloped roofs that made the house look like it was brooding. Inside was dark, a cavern with large rooms, few windows, and clusters of dusty shadows that always seemed to move. Spiders lived everywhere, like a witch's house, or a cursed castle with occupants in desperate need of a hero. The land around it was a rural wonderland, golden hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were mountains on the horizon, and the shadowy green smear of a forest in the distance. I had never climbed those mountains, nor entered that forest, but it was enough that they were there. I could look out the window and see them, and believe that something wonderful, something magical was out there. To me, it was paradise. To my mom, it was hell, a monument to her misery. She'd moved in just after Dad left. She could barely afford the place and struggled to make ends meet. The stresses of insolvency, abandonment, and a desperately sick child nearly killed her. She lost too much weight, her skin faded into a papery, translucent coating that stretched dangerously thin over her skull. I used to have nightmares that the flesh would split apart, revealing the glistening bone beneath. She got home from work one night, looking particularly ill. She turned to me, probably to ask if I'd care for dinner, but as soon as she opened her mouth, she threw up. Black, red, and foul yellow splashed across the floor like blood-streaked poison. She kept crying that it burned. I called 911, which made her cry harder because she didn't have the money for an ambulance. The very next morning, we learned that she was dying. She kept her job as long as she could. When she quit, that was the end. She had no money for hospital stays or medicine. That was why the burden of her care and Noah's fell to me. I didn't mind at first. I loved my mom more than anything, and her illness, terrible as it was, made it easy to be close to her. But as she deteriorated, she required exponentially more care I wasn't remotely capable of providing. But there was no room in the equation for capability. I went to school less and less until I stopped altogether. No one even noticed. It was like they'd forgotten me already. Mom didn't like it, but she didn't stop me. How could she? Some days, she couldn't even go to the bathroom on her own. The effort it took to simply stay alive drained her. She usually fell asleep before nightfall, always with her TV on. Noah did too, since he slept in her bed. That left me by myself every night, alone in a cavernous house with only the echo of their TV to keep me company. 3 sad, forgotten people, waiting for everything to finish falling apart. 3 people in a cursed house, desperately waiting for the hero to rescue them. I was supposed to stay inside because the hills weren't safe after dark, but I spent most nights outside anyway. Oak trees dotted the hills, great tangles of mistletoe festooning the branches. Raccoons and deer passed through constantly. Crows roosted everywhere, even on the car, and cawed fiercely whenever I tried to shoo them off. Woodpeckers buried acorns in the walls of the house. Owls called to each other. Bats swooped like scraps of living enchantment against the night sky, and coyotes slinked through the golden grass. Rafts of miner's lettuce exploded along the property line, so thick and soft you could sleep in it. Sometimes I did, on warm, golden evenings, and sometimes on cold, gray nights. I went to the miner's lettuce. Sometimes I read. Usually I rested, drifting off to the song of night insects and the low oceanic rush of wind through the leaves. Those nights were the closest thing I had to a fairy tale. Although every last one of those days was awful in its own way, one unseasonably hot September afternoon was the worst. The day was rotten from the start. Mom insisted on making breakfast, which gave me a stirring of hope. Maybe this would be one of her good days. That hope was brutally crushed when it became apparent that she didn't have enough strength to hold the skillet. She dropped it, cracking several tiles and denting the skillet in the process. She cried while I scrambled the eggs and wiped tears from my face. Noah decided it was my fault that Mom was sad, which made him angry. That rage built up until he launched himself at me as I served breakfast. I lost grip and spilled half the eggs on the floor. An hour later, Mom threw up everywhere, blood and bile and small curls of undigested eggs. It smelled foul and sticky, clinging inside my nose, leaking down and coating my throat as I scrubbed away. Mom started to cry again as I cleaned up, which infuriated Noah anew. He didn't have the vocabulary to express himself, so he just kept screaming, "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!" I pretended to ignore him, gritting my teeth so hard they ached. Suddenly, he lunged for me. I dodged, but he knocked over the bucket instead, sending a flood of bloody, sudsy water across the floor. I saw red. Mom, Noah, the furniture, the foul cascade of blood, bile, soap, and egg, all of it red, lined in golden autumn sunlight. Noah stomped in front of me and screamed, "Stop it!" I struck him. The crack was cataclysmic, the beginning of the end of the world. His eyes went wide as he fell down and began to cry. My mother shouted at me, or tried to. Her weak voice was barely a whisper, but I caught the gist anyway. She was trying to send me to my room. After everything I'd done, she was punishing me. I spun around and stormed outside, slamming the door with such force the house quaked. I blinked, momentarily blinded by the bright sun. The day was warm, the trees in the garden were lush, birds sang, crows called to each other. In the distance, coyotes yipped. I marched to the backyard, biting my lip as my face crumpled. I focused on the miner's lettuce out near the property line. I reached it right as the tears began to fall. I flopped down and curled up. The scent of greenness and cold, dark earth swept over me, inside me, cleansing my lungs of the stench of my mother's slow death while the birds sang and the wind rushed through the leaves. I dreamed of crows, coyotes, and a brooding castle in which a paper-skinned princess who looked like my mother leaned out the window, screaming words that transformed into ribbons of foamy, bile-laced blood. "What are you doing?" The princess evaporated. I opened my eyes and found myself face to face with a Halloween mask, half hidden in the miner's lettuce. "It's awfully late for an afternoon nap," the mask said. What a weird nightmare, I thought, staggering to my feet. The crushed lettuce left wet, dewy streaks on my skin. It felt real, not like a dream at all. "Who are you?" The mask lurched forward, followed by a strange, terribly skinny body clothed in a mud-caked dress. It took a long, disorienting moment to realize the body was emerging from a burrow in the miner's lettuce. She drew herself up into a sitting position and crossed her arms. They looked wrong, those arms, emaciated, draped in dry folds of wrinkled flesh the color of buttermilk. "My name is Windy," she smiled, and I realized her mask, a ravaged, moon-colored mess of scars, dark holes, and nets of wrinkles around bright, flat eyes like coins, was not a mask, but her face. When I spoke, my voice was issued in a panicky rush. "You can't be here. You're trespassing." "No, you're trespassing." She rose to her feet in a single, boneless movement and picked her way through the miner's lettuce in a wormy, twitchy march that made my skin crawl. She halted several feet away. "This is your property line. Everything behind it is yours. Everything on this side is not." I watched helplessly. This was no nightmare. This was real. And maybe it was a fairy tale, but not mine, because I was the oldest brother. In fairy tales, the oldest always fails, leaving the youngest behind to save the kingdom. And I, the stupid eldest, had just failed by trespassing on a monster's territory. "I'm sorry," I whispered. She flounced toward me, dry hair rippling behind her. Something on her neck bounced in time with her steps, broken and stained, an old animal bone strung upon dirty twine. Why are you sorry? My brothers liked sleeping here too." "Brothers? This thing, this hideous, wintry monster with eyes like cloud-shrouded moons, had brothers? Are your brothers here? Are they in the burrow too? Are they watching? Do you want to know where they are?" Would this appease the monster? Would listening save my life? Yes. She looked up, the dying light reflected in her eyes. Her skin looked so sick, somehow thick and papery all at once. "I hid them in the trees." Then she stepped past me. I watched, frightened and confused, as she drifted through the golden grass and faded into the night. Once darkness had swallowed her entirely, my paralysis broke, and I bolted. By the time I reached the house, Noah and Mom were asleep. I ran to her room without thinking, jealousy and resentment forgotten. I just wanted my mom. She would keep me safe from the horrors in the hills. "But how?" asked a mean, broken, and terribly small voice in the back of my head. "She can barely even stand. Why do you think she cries? Because she knows she can't protect you, and because she knows you know it too." I stopped inches from her door, struggling as fear, jealousy, guilt, anger, and love fought for dominance. Anger won. I retreated to the living room and locked the doors. After a long time, I fell asleep, straight into another nightmare. The princess, who looked like my mother, lay bleeding in a field of miner's lettuce. A white mountain lion prowled, murky, silver eyes cutting dim swaths through the darkness. Nearby, a half-eaten coyote with golden eyes whimpered as it bled to death. Wind roared through the leaves. Bats swooped overhead, nestling in the pendulous clusters of mistletoe that pulsed like hearts. The mountain lion came closer, Green juice from the crushed miner's lettuce stained the snowy coat. I couldn't run. I tried to close my eyes, but couldn't do that either. I watched, unable to move or even scream, until it crept past me, slinking toward the princess. My paralysis broke as tears dripped from the coyote's golden eyes. "Please come back," it said in Windy's voice. I woke up, nauseous and drenched in sweat. It was morning, but barely. For reasons I didn't dare fathom, I went outside. It was windy and shockingly cold. The big patch of miner's lettuce looked dark and deep in the thin light, like a half-hidden lake. I took a deep breath and began to walk. When I reached the miner's lettuce, I stopped and scanned the patch as my heart pounded. But of course there was no coyote, no blood, certainly no white mountain lion. Only the spot where I liked to nap. Beside it was the half-hidden burrow, and inside shining like yellow lens flares. "What are you doing here?" Windy asked. "Looking for you," I blurted. She blinked. Then she crawled out of the burrow. Her bone necklace caked with mud and stringy white roots swung back and forth. She looked even worse in the morning light. Eyes, one of which was wider than the other and clouded, were murky yellow. Her skin was the worst, fragile and dry, twisted with thick scars and pocked with deep holes like insect burrows. "What are you?" I asked. "Why? Are you afraid?" For a moment I couldn't breathe. What did the monster need to hear? Affirmation of her own magnificent fearsomeness? Or something else? My mind worked fast. She was terrifying to behold, but she hadn't hurt me. If anything, she'd been a little bit silly. What kind of monster acted like a regular kid? "No," I lied. Windy smiled. "Good." Then she took my hand and pulled me through the carpet of miner's lettuce and into the hills. I didn't resist, because even if she seemed kind, she was still a monster, and I was the oldest brother. The sun rose and the day brightened as we walked. After some time, the forest evolved from a shadowy green smear to a spectacular wall of trees. I eyed it with frightened excitement. I'd never ventured inside myself. The forest had always been too far away, but now I was here. Not only would I finally explore it, I would do so with a monster beside me. But to my disappointment, Windy veered sharply, avoiding the trees entirely. "Why aren't we going in?" I asked. "Because I hate it." "Oh, where are we going?" "Right over there." She dropped my hand and sprinted off into the long grass. I followed, but I was cautious, scanning the ground for rattlesnakes and tarantulas before each step. When I caught up with her, I was standing at the base of a particularly grand valley oak. "Do you like this tree?" she asked. I looked up at it, nonplussed. The huge canopy threw an impressive radius of dappled shadows. Crows roosted in the branches, peering down at me with bright eyes. "Sure." "So do I. It's the only tree I like. I used to climb it with my brothers, but only at night." "Do your brothers come out at night?" "No," she said. I watched her, equal parts repulsed and captivated. "They're dead. The monster got them a long time ago." I couldn't muster an answer. "I tell everyone who comes here about the monster," she continued. "Not just you. I have to. I'm the only one who knows it's here. Everyone else forgot." Despite my fear, I was fascinated, eager even, gripped by the dark, obsessive enchantment unique to the childhood. This was it. It had happened, somehow in the middle of a tragedy and my own backyard. I had stumbled on a fairy tale. What kind of monster? "The worst kind." "Do your brothers know about it?" "They didn't believe in it." She looked up at the branches, the web-like pattern reflected in her eyes. "I don't want to talk about them anymore." So we did not. Instead, we talked about worms and bats, bumblebees and bobcats, acorns and moths. Windy taught me that wild chamomile growing in my yard could be harvested for tea, that miner's lettuce could be eaten, and that raccoons washed their food. She said that crows had been in this valley since the world's first days, which was why they lived everywhere, settling trees the way people settle neighborhoods. And the reason that coyotes loved the long yellow grass was because it camouflaged their fur. Mom would love to hear this, I thought. And just like that, Wendy's spell was broken. Reality came crashing down. I jumped up as images of my mother filled my head. I have to go. Where? Wendy stood eagerly, turning her bone pendant between her fingers. Home. Her face fell. Oh. You can come, I offered, even as my heart sank. She gave me a smile that made her skin crinkle like a big dry leaf. Thank you, but I can't. Well, then I'll come see you tomorrow. Her smile slipped. Or tonight? She hitched it back up. Good. There's magic here. That thought buoyed me for the rest of the day. When Noah screamed at me, I just smiled. When Mom gave me anxious looks, I kissed the top of her head, impervious for once to the scent of spoilage that clung to her like bad perfume. Once they'd gone to bed, I slipped out the back door, heading for the miner's lettuce. Insects drifted in the dying light like scraps of gold. I didn't see Wendy anywhere. When I looked in the burrow, there was only darkness. Disappointment settled over me, surprisingly bitter. When two bony legs with cracked white skin fell in front of my face, I stumbled back, screaming. Overhead, someone burst out laughing. I looked up and saw Wendy dangling from a branch. She dropped to the ground, laughed so hard that her wrinkled face resembled a very happy and slightly rotted pumpkin. Before I knew it, I was laughing too. By the time we stopped, it was almost dark. As I stood, a bat swooped in front of my face. I wheeled back and fell again. This sent us both into another hysterical fit of laughter. This time we laughed until long past dark. For the first time in years I felt like a child, a hero on an adventure, a happy ending waiting on the horizon. Joy, not fear, permeated reality. And it was all because of Wendy. As we ventured into the nighttime hills, she continued the morning's lecture, instructing me on the habits of bats, how to calm a frightened deer, how to handle rattlesnakes. As we skirted the forest, she looked at it wistfully. There used to be a beautiful pond there, deep in the trees. Well, it would have been beautiful if it weren't covered in scum. The moon was high when we once again reached the enormous oak, standing like an alien sentinel in the darkness. Come on, Wendy said. Let's climb. My heart plummeted. The oak loomed over me, impossibly tall. Branches cut the night sky into starry fractals. I can't. I have something to show you. She disappeared up the trunk like a squirrel. It was the last thing I wanted to do, but if a hero can't conquer his fear, then he's no hero at all. So I followed. Finding a grip on the tree was hard. Shimmying up was even harder. The bark scraped my hands and knees, and I knocked my head against the branches. Wendy! Far overhead, the leaves rustled. I'm here. What's taking you so long? I kept climbing. She was waiting near the top, balancing on a precariously thin branch. Hurry, she whispered. By me. I eyed the branch nervously, but there was nothing to do. I hauled myself up, grimly ignoring my throbbing bloody hands, and settled beside her. She pointed to the branch, thick with leaves and mistletoe. Look! I squinted, wondering what I was supposed to see. The leaves? They were thicker here. So thick they blocked the stars entirely. But so what? Did she really drag me all the way to the top to show me big leaves? I opened my mouth to ask her, but before I could speak, one of the leaves took flight. Bats! Their small bodies hung from the branches, swaying and quivering. They were everywhere. The old tree was a roost. Panic overtook me. My heart slammed against my ribs as I twisted and tried to climb down. Wendy caught my shoulder. Look! She held out her other hand, which looked as thin and delicate as the bats themselves. I watched, astonished, as 3 bats shivered open and swung, latching onto her fingers. They crawled along her arm with quick, twitchy movements. More followed. 1, 2, 3, 6, 10, 12. Wendy laughed merrily and tipped her hand against my shoulder. "It tickles. Here, you try." The bats surged across her in a jerky flood and crawled onto me. I covered my eyes as the first of many tiny claws tugged my shirt. Velvet bellies and warm wings inched across my skin, one after the other. It did tickle. After a long time, I opened my eyes. Bats covered me from waist to shoulder, clinging tightly as a gust of wind moaned through the canopy. The branch swayed dangerously. I grasped the trunk in a panic. The bats took flight, rising in clouds. Moonlight shone through their membranous wings, throwing their bones into sharp relief. Something roiled in my chest and bubbled up my throat. I thought it was a scream, but when I opened my mouth, as laughter exploded. Windy joined me as the bats swooped around us. Wind moaned through the branches. Leaves roared like the tide. In the distance, coyotes howled. Windy threw her arms around me, and together we kept laughing. I visited Windy every evening. Each night I discovered that I needed to sleep a little less. By November, I didn't need to sleep at all. And thank God, sleep would have forced me to miss out on our adventures. We climbed oak trees, crawled through the bracken with its tangles of thorns and late-season wildflowers, raced each other through the hills, and napped in the miner's lettuce. And then there were the animals. Every animal in the hills obeyed Windy's commands. Hawks aligned on our hands, talons nicking soft skin. Deer crept through the tall grass and touched their soft noses to ours. Large eyes so wide they reflected the entire landscape. We pet black bears, became roosts for bats, ran with coyotes, rooted in the dark earth with wild hogs, and cuddled every feral cat that crossed our path. In my memory, those days are warm and golden, and the nights are cold and clear, with blasts of icy wind that woke me in a way nothing has before or since. Like everything to do with Windy, it made me feel alive. I was happy and utterly, completely myself, untethered to the quiet, bitter tragedy of my mother and brother. I had a magical wildness that transcended freedom itself, a state I could only enter when I was exploring hills, trees, and mountains with Windy. The only place we did not explore was the forest. It seems insane in hindsight, but everything was insane, not just Windy herself, although she was plenty insane on her own, but the way wild animals came to us, tamer than dogs, or my metamorphosis into an odd lost boy who didn't need sleep. My mother's illness was insane too. That she had to be alive while rotting from the inside out wasn't just insane, it was monstrous. So was Noah's prognosis. The fact that I would be an orphan at 12, that my disabled brother and I would be placed into different foster homes, perhaps never to see each other again, was insane. And the reality that my mother would be dead before my 13th birthday, less than half a year, was insane. The fact that the truth, that nobody cared, that no one would remember us, that my mother, my brother, and I were already forgotten, was the most insane thing of all. Compared to that, Windy's forest didn't even register. On a frigid evening when the sky was clear and bright and snow crowned the moonlit mountains, I prepared to go see Windy, as usual. But on my way out, I felt a tug on my coat. I looked down and saw Noah. "Go back to bed," I told him. He shook his head. Anger stirred, but quickly died. Noah would be an orphan too, at 4, not 12. He might not even remember Mom. What would be worse to remember and ache for her until he died, or to forget her altogether. What if he forgot me? What if he ended up in a bad foster home? What if it ended up being hell? And what if he never remembered anything else? For the first time in weeks, a lump formed in my throat as reality came to roost. And with it, a bitter truth. If anyone needed a fairy tale, it wasn't me, it was Noah. "Okay," I said, "let's get your coat." We went out into the frosty night. Dead bracken crunched under our feet. The moon shone high and cold, drenching the darkness in a film of silver. Bats flew overhead, throwing thin, unsettling shadows. I knelt down by the burrow. Noah looked at me curiously, then followed suit. "Windy," I whispered. "Are you awake?" Silence. Then two golden lens flares blinked to life. "Oh," Noah whispered. The light reflected off his face as he reached out to touch them. Then long fingers, thin, cracked, bright as the moon, slid out of the burrow and shook his hand. "Who's this?" Windy asked. "My brother," I said. Inside the burrow, something curved and pale glinted under her lens flare eyes. A crescent. A smile. Noah froze as Windy slid out and unfolded before him. His gaze tracked upward along her arm, to her shoulder, finally settling on her face. His eyes widened, reflecting the nightscape. When he spoke his first full sentence. "What is that?" "Noah," I snapped. He shook his head and tried to pull back, but Windy didn't let go. "No! No!" "Noah!" "No!" He wrenched away. I caught him, but he recoiled and twisted. He dug his nails into my hand and screamed. It echoed through the night, so maddeningly shrill that coyotes yipped in response. Then he bit me. His teeth felt sharp and electric, somehow rotten. I let go. And he ran. I chased him for what felt like hours, screaming at him to come back. That just spurred him on, small legs carrying him faster than even I could hope to run. He moved farther and farther ahead, a dark shape glossed in silver, speeding towards the forest's edge. I watched, helpless, as he finally disappeared among the trees. The forest loomed before me, a monstrous tangle of shadow and starlight, and thick, menacing darkness. I hesitated, craning my neck as I listened for Noah, but I heard nothing, so I plunged in, because a hero who can't clean up his own messes is no hero at all. As soon as I ducked under the canopy, the world changed. Stars bled through the dying leaves. Pale mists curled through the branches. A delicate sheen of silver covered the entire forest. I thought of my old nightmare, the pale cougar with silver eyes, eating the coyote that spoke in Windy's voice. I shivered and kept walking. I wondered vaguely where I might find Windy's scum-blanketed pond. On the heels of that came thoughts of Windy's monster. I wondered whether it had silver eyes like the cougar. Fear suddenly took root and exploded upward. I was too old to believe in monsters. But I was in a dark forest on an enchanted night. How could I believe in anything else? Leaves and twigs crunched underfoot. Patterns of broken moonlight danced over my skin. I sidestepped roots and rocks, silently reassuring myself. There are no monsters. They aren't real. There are no monsters. They aren't real. There are no monsters. I hopped over an upraised root, but instead of touching the ground, my foot went down and down and down, spilling me onto the forest floor. Disintegrated leaves and fine, silky dust exploded in a cold cloud. It tasted old and rich, a combination of oak, sage, filth, and dirty fur that melted into mud on my tongue. I sat up, gagging, and turned. Behind me I saw an earthen ledge that formed a high, lopsided step, snaked through with roots. I spat out the mud and stood up. There in the trees, behind the tree root stare, were eyes like murky starlight. There are no monsters. Something shifted. They aren't real. Something bony and broken and long. Long as a tree. A fallen, bug-infested tree exploding with rot. There are no monsters. They aren't real. But that thing was very real. I ran. Behind me, leaves crackled and twigs snapped under rapid footfalls. There are no monsters. No monsters. No monsters. No monsters. No monsters. A low roar bored into my rib cage and thrummed. So shockingly powerful it paralyzed me. I was sure my bones would disintegrate. I would collapse, a puddle of flesh and clothes and powdered bone. Someday a tree would grow from my bone meal, and I would be part of the forest, part of the monster, forgotten by the world as I grew web-like branches and sprouted leaves that would host pendulums of mistletoe. Then the roar cut off. So did my transfiguration. I was no longer a tree, just a boy, a frightened boy running from the monster in the deep, dark woods. I ran until I heard birdsong underscored by the hoarse commentary of crows. A cat darted across my path, fur shining in the sunlight. I sobbed and glanced over my shoulder before I lost my nerve. A doe stared back, half hidden in the trees. "What are you doing here?" I spun around in a panic. It was Windy. "Come on, we have to get out of the trees. I hate them." The sun shafted weakly through the forest canopy, throwing patterns of light and shadow that moved over our skin as we ran. I glanced uneasily at the trees. Branches like great drooping webs spread overhead, bleeding dusty beams of sunlight. Finally, in the distance, I spied the shaded patch of miner's lettuce. On the hill behind it stood my house. When we crossed the tree line, reality crashed over the world, dismantling the dark spell of the forest and its silver-eyed monster. Before I could even draw breath, Windy turned on me. "How could you go in there?" "I had to!" Dread exploded as I remembered why I'd gone into the woods in the first place. What kind of hero abandons a sick little boy to the mercy of a monster? No hero at all. I turned back as the shadows of the trees fell across me. I felt their pull, like fishing lines reeling me in. "My brother!" She grabbed me and spun around, slamming me to the ground with such force I could barely comprehend it. "No!" she screamed. "I told you!" I tried to stand, but my limbs wouldn't obey. "I can't let him!" "I told you there was a monster." "But my brother's in there! I couldn't leave him! You didn't leave me!" Her face crumpled. She looked uglier than ever, too ugly to be real. "Yes, it's bad to abandon your brothers." She wiped her eyes, pushing up folds of loose, dry skin. "I need to show you something." "But Noah is safe," she said. "I made sure. I always take care of my brothers. Follow me." Then she got down on all fours and crawled into her burrow. I looked up at my house, then down at the burrow. Windy or home? Despite my fear and the marrow-deep exhaustion weighing me down, the choice was surprisingly easy. I dropped to my belly and slid in after her. The burrow was wet and cold, mud squished under my fingers. Pale roots dangled like the legs of ghostly spiders. A large earthworm glistened briefly before diving into the earth. Then darkness engulfed me, and I saw nothing at all. I crawled blindly. The hiss of Windy's bony form sliding ahead was the only thing that kept panic at bay. By the time I emerged into the sunlight, my bones ached with cold. Every inch of skin was numb. My clothes were muddy, and those thin, pale roots tangled around my fingers like waterlogged hair. I closed my eyes against the light. It felt painfully bright, but I knew it wasn't. I sensed the gloomy, muted quality of the sun, and knew that we were back among the trees. I frowned. Why did Windy, who hated the forest, have a home that spilled directly into its heart? "Open your eyes," Windy said. I did. Directly before me, perched an inch or two off the dark earth, was a discolored bulb, shot with cracks and two large, dark holes like eyes. Only when I noticed the jaw beneath, small, malformed, with less than a dozen teeth, did I understand what I was seeing. My head felt light, my chest pressurized, as though a rapidly inflating balloon had replaced my heart. I looked around. There were so many. They carpeted the earth, sprouting from dead leaves like obscene flowers, small and large, dark and pale, some whole, some broken, some with smashed-in faces, some little more than lopsided jaws or jagged skull caps. "These are my brothers," said Windy. "No one remembers them, or the monster who killed them." The balloon in my chest inflated sharply, pressing painfully against my ribs and throat. Eyes like dirty silver pools filled my head. Monsters aren't real. "This one is," said Windy. "It lives in the trees. You have to listen, or you'll end up like then." "I'm not your brother." Her face was changing, fading, bleeding away like light bleeds from the evening sky. I couldn't look at her for long. "When you forget a monster," she said, "you allow it to thrive, to take over. Why didn't you tell me you had a brother too? I shrugged defensively. Tell me about him. Of course you wanted to know about Noah. All anyone ever cared about was Noah. Why should Windy be any different? He's sick. With what? Something he was born with. He's retarded. And he won't live very long, because his organs aren't growing right. He can't form memories very well. When my mom dies, he might not remember her. Tears stung my eyes. Suddenly it was hard to breathe. Or me. He'll have to go to a special foster home, and I won't be able to come. He'll think we left him. Why does he have to go? Why can't he stay here with you and your mom? How amazing, I thought. How bitterly, selfishly amazing that I hadn't yet told Windy of Noah or my mother. Everything came out of me. I could almost see it flooding the forest floor, an infected pool rising around the Garden of Skulls. It's like Mom and Noah existed for nothing. No one cares that they're here. No one will care when they're gone. I wept. No one will even remember them. They don't matter to anyone, and I can't change that. Nothing I do is enough. Windy sat, motionless, in my periphery. She looked terrifying in silhouette, absolutely gut-wrenchingly, incomprehensibly horrifying. But when she spoke, she sounded gentle, so very, very gentle. Why didn't you tell me? Because, I wept, I didn't want to think about it. You didn't want to remember? I shook my head and continued to cry. Silence followed, broken only by the wind and the steps of tiny animals picking through the dead leaves. Then Windy spoke. I expected her to tell me about her brothers. But even though the skulls of 100 dead boys surrounded us, she told me about crows and red ants and condors, all of which eat dead things. Once the scavengers have their fill, she said, the carcasses of dead animals rot into the soil, to be drawn up through the roots of jealous, hungry trees and eaten. I remembered the dust in my mouth, how it had tasted of oak and rot. My gorge rose. Living things are alive because they eat dead things. Windy turned her bone pendant over and over in her hands. That is the only way living things can live. She looked up at the sprawling web of branches, especially the trees. They're more alive than any of us know. I finally looked at her. Her skin was thinner and older than I'd ever seen it. Her eyes looked flat, yet endless, with dim, cloudy spots under the surface, like dead things drifting under the murky water. If you could be like me, she said, would you? Yes. 1,000 years of cold, clear nights filled with bats and deer and laughter would be a dream come true. No worries, no sickness, no future, only magic. What if it meant you had to eat something that was alive? She asked quietly. Would you still do it? This is wrong, whispered a small voice in the back of my head. All of it was wrong. Her way with animals, how she made them behave even when their bodies quivered and their eyes rolled. Her cold burrow, her skeletal thinness, her wormy movements, the broken desiccation of her skin, and her eyes, her clouded, dead eyes. I shot to my feet. I have to go! I know. I walked as fast as I could without running, shuddering when I passed her burrow. I didn't dare go through it again. The thought of being trapped, of being chased by a skeletal monster whose dry body rasped against the walls, nearly sent me into a panic. The forest surrounded me, all dusty green and golden gloom. I thought of monsters, wrapped in human bodies, blending with the twisted branches, spidery hands stretching out of the shadows, mottled skin camouflaged in the dappled light. I took a deep breath. There are no monsters. Windy's cracked, dead face filled my mind's eye. They aren't real. The trees finally thinned. The brittle sunlight grew brighter and green glimmered through the trees. The miner's lettuce, the boundary between my world and Windy's, and behind it, my house. I broke into a run, and didn't stop until I burst through the door. My mother was waiting, her emaciated face twisted in fury. Noah, who was napping on the love seat, didn't stir. "What?" she snarled. "Were you thinking?" Her words crushed me, so I crushed her. That it would be good to get him out of here and away from you for a little while. He doesn't have to die just because you are. The words hung in the air, echoing, reverberating until they broke what was left of my world, like magic words spoken by a monster instead of the hero. I regretted them instantly, but it didn't help. Nothing I did, or could do, or would ever do, could help. I looked at Noah. His hands were scraped raw. His little palms looked flayed, coated in papery scabs and raw flesh. I thought of the forest, its hungry roots and jagged rocks, and withered. Mom. "Go," she said. She looked 100 years old. Papery skin stretched over a skull, eagerly anticipating the day it would escape her. "Just go." I looked at my brother again, flopped bonelessly over the cushions. Only the rise and fall of his chest gave any indication that he was alive. Wendy's voice echoed in my ear. "Living things are alive because they eat dead things." An image exploded in my head, my mother arranging freshly butchered pieces of my little brother on the kitchen table as she prepared to eat him, while his eyes, flat and discolored, with cloudy pale things flickering in their depths, bored into mine. I burst into tears. That night, for the first time in months, I slept. There's so much more to tell of Windy, of what she was and what she did. But I'm so tired. Far too tired to remember any more monsters tonight. And this concludes story time. Thanks for listening.